Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. I'm the Introverted Astrologer and I'm back with my promised video which looks closely at the fortunes of Andy Burnham. Just like Keir Starmer, we don't have a birth time sadly, but this is where numerology can fill in many gaps. So we'll cover that too towards the end of this video. Now, is this man going to be a saviour in our rather polarised and disheartened country, or is he simply going to split the vote even further? This is my take on this man during this very tumultuous year. So the chart of this man is of extreme interest to all of us at the moment. When I last looked at it was roughly 10 weeks ago, and I was struck by just how many astrological progressions he had that would be exact around the year of 2029. I had the strong impression that this was somebody who was absolutely gunning for something that he wanted. He was moving towards something very significant. This does not necessarily mean he will achieve it, but that a great deal of energy was being invested in it. And so the events of the last couple of months are starting to provide us with answers. So what else is this chart describing to us between now and 2029? Sadly, we have no birth time, similar to Keir Starmer, but that didn't remove all the tools from us and we were still able to gauge quite a lot about Starmer. This chart is now irrevocably connected with the United Kingdom too, because it is the chart of the person who is technically in charge of the country. Now, if you want to have a look at my analysis of his birth chart, I'll put the link for that video in the description box below this one. Now, something worthwhile pointing out is that where Keir Starmer and also Nigel Farage had got these huge clumps of planets in mutable signs, this is actually a chart where mutable energy is underrepresented, and in fact we instead have this predominance of cardinal energy. And so those qualities of taking the lead, of initiating, of being self-starters, people with a strong degree of self-will, they are noteworthy. There is also only one planet in air, and that is Uranus. There is also only one planet in fire, and again it's an outer planet, and this is Neptune here in Sagittarius. So we could say from this that this isn't a chart that needs constant stimulation and intellectual engagement in order to function. It's much more grounded with all this earth, and there is emotional investment brought in by Mars and Jupiter. I suspect this speaks of Burnham's motivation more likely coming from what he sees as being necessary, what he has personally and directly experienced, what he feels responsible for, more than from a cerebral interest in ideas or ideology or politics. It isn't that there's no fire or air, but because these elements are being brought in by the outer planets, Burnham may well need to cultivate those qualities more consciously rather than them simply being automatically available. Now, I have heard it suggested that Burnham's retrograde Mercury makes him a poor communicator. I'm not personally convinced of that. If any of my viewers have a retrograde Mercury, please do not think of yourself in terms of being a poor communicator. What this can mean is that there is a more internal way of thinking, which is more prone to reflecting and reconsidering. Communication may not always be immediate, but it doesn't mean that it's poor. Similarly, Mercury in Capricorn is very pragmatic, very structured. It looks hard at what is useful, what can reasonably be achieved. There may not be fantastic intellectual fireworks or gripping sound bites. Communication can be more sensible, more purposeful and cautious. Now, at the time of the recent Makerfield elections, the only really significant transit that was going on was between Burnham's Venus, which was receiving a very tight square aspect from Saturn. This is certainly not a transit which you would associate with success and champagne, but it is interesting to note that these two are in a position which we call mutual reception in his natal chart. In other words, Venus is in the sign Capricorn, which Saturn is one of the natural rulers of. Saturn is in Taurus, which is one of Venus's homes. And so these two planets have an established relationship and they tend to support each other. They come with this ability to cooperate with each other. It may not stop the transit being a difficult test, a pressure, but it does show that the natal chart is giving the planets a way to cooperate. And there is another case of this in Burnham's chart, and that's because he has a Mars which is in the sign of Pisces. Pisces is one of Jupiter's homes. Jupiter is in Scorpio, and Mars rules the sign of Scorpio in the traditional sense. And so we have two planetary pairs that work together and reinforce each other during Burnham's life. They are actually in a sesquiquadrate aspect to each other. So although there is some tension, there is also some assistance and the ability to turn conviction into action. It does spice up that Mars in Pisces somewhat. Pisces isn't inherently an aggressive or confrontational kind of sign. The nearby North Node is amplifying Mars's significance though, and so I wouldn't see this Mars as being weak. It is nonetheless significant. You could see its message as being that one doesn't always have to shout to be strong. Now, in terms of transits, that square from Saturn to Burnham's natal Venus is a lengthier one. Its parting shot is around February or March of 2027 when it makes its final exact square to Venus. And so becoming realistic about relationships, responsibilities, the values we hold, a test of what relationships are worthwhile and durable enough to survive the transit, all of those themes may be important. It's difficult to know more without having the exact houses. But what about the transits between now and the next election? What else can I pick up? Well, we do have a passing square from Saturn moving in the sky to his natal sun next year. This could be difficult for a few weeks, and it is a one-off because Saturn won't retrograde over this degree. So we may have another test or difficulty coming in then. We saw in the case of Keir Starmer that even these one-off transits from Saturn can still be very tough, even if they aren't lengthy. When one of these unfolded in Keir Starmer's chart, there was a tendency for heads to roll. There was reputational damage, blows to his confidence and public image. And so would we surmise from this one coming up for Burnham next spring that he will be out of his office then? Now, in the absence of corroborating contacts, I would be very sceptical that the damage would be of an amount to lead to the loss of his office. Please note, I don't have his angles and I'm working blind. However, I am confident that his authority could be tested at this time. There will be a passing few weeks where he needs to get realistic. Sometimes Saturn Sun can see us having to take on a bigger burden or more responsibility, or perhaps we suffer some reputational damage. Saturn is insisting on accountability, on playing by the rules, on being responsible. We may also have to face up to consequences of previous actions when Saturn and Sun meet. What we are seeing in Nigel Farage's case at the moment is a more lengthy contact from Saturn to his Sun, and so those Sun-Saturn themes of being accountable, of understanding that we have to play within the rules and that there are consequences, all of those issues are very pertinent in Farage's life at the moment. And so next spring we may see Burnham undergo a similar lesson, but over a shorter period. Now, there will be another transit from Saturn to his Mercury, but not until 2028. And once again, this is a one-off transit. Now, Saturn-Mercury periods can coincide with some serious pressure around issues of communication. And because we are also looking at this chart as reflecting events which are of consequence to the country, Mercury can represent the key issues of communicating, of policy. And if my memory serves right, when Keir Starmer had Saturn contacts to his Mercury, key figures around him who advised on matters of policy saw their heads roll during a reality check from Saturn. So in 2028 we could see that Burnham has his attention very narrowed to one particular subject area, which is policy, communication, and being accountable for that in ways which may well feel uncomfortable for him. Now, Burnham has his second Saturn return, which takes place around April-May 2028. Saturn transiting in the sky will pass over his natal Saturn in a one-off pass. This isn't a lengthy second Saturn return. And I would point out that second Saturn returns come with quite a dramatic reputation, and I don't think it's actually warranted. So if any viewers are anticipating their second Saturn return soon, my message to you is not to be anxious about it. It is essentially a period of stock taking, and it would take a lot of difficult transits or progressions in your chart to compound that second Saturn return and turn it into something that was immensely difficult. It really is not. And the older that we get, the more we become accustomed to Saturn's lessons about being realistic, taking responsibility, acting within our limits, what we have achieved so far versus where we may feel we've fallen short. So Burnham in 2028 has a couple of Saturn contacts, and so he may need to detach to analyse how far he's come, what he's achieved, where he's failed. He may decide to restructure or reassess things which he doesn't perceive to be working. He could be examining the political legacy he's creating, and it's a chance for him to become much more discerning about what still needs to be done. Now, 2028 also caught my eye for other reasons, including the fact that eclipses will begin impacting his chart during this year. In particular, his Mercury and his Sun will both be subject to eclipse energy around July of 2028. Both the solar and the lunar eclipses will hit these points within very tight orbs. Now, this particular eclipse energy is more gentle. It speaks of successful outcomes or resolutions of worries or illness that may have been hanging over our heads for some time. And so these concerns we have may actually seem to worsen very briefly, and then they suddenly clear away. So the overall theme is moving through long-term difficulties with a successful and fairly rapid resolution. We can also consider some of the progressed movements within Burnham's chart, and progressions is where all the planets in our birth chart move forward one day in our astrological ephemeris for every 1 year of life that we've lived. And you can see down here that his progressed Mars is currently at 28 degrees and 35 of Aries. Now, Mars was moving a bit over half a degree a day on the day that Burnham was born, so its progressed position will almost certainly be out by a few minutes either way. It is moving towards a square with his natal Mercury. I would see this tense engagement as bringing in a real pressure on how we speak, think and communicate. There could be very strong drives to achieve with our words, including heated words, impatience, impulsivity, a tendency perhaps to act before we have thought things through. I can't be precise, I'm afraid, with regard to the time frame. I do feel a bit more confident looking at his solar arc, in this case solar arc Mercury, and this solar arc Mercury will oppose his natal Pluto, most likely sometime next year, and this is rather hinting at a time when we will have very powerful ways of thinking in depth and also of persuading people around us. That Mercury could also speak of new policies, new ways of thinking, and the means to introduce the policy in very powerful, persuasive ways. And I do actually find this interesting also because I know that I had made some general forecasts about Keir Starmer. I could see 2027 bringing in even more disruption for Starmer. I had thought it likely that in that disruption there could be big tensions around ideology, because I am seeing a couple of things relating to Mercury being more active in Burnham's chart in the coming year, 2027, coupled with what I can see in Keir Starmer's chart. I wonder if certain measures introduced next year become too much for Keir Starmer to adjust to, and that indeed the changing face of Labour is no longer aligned with his own personal values. In terms of major transits between now and 2029, I don't see Burnham's chart being significantly knocked off course, and that's because the transits from Uranus are not going to affect him in the same way that Farage's chart is set up. This is not a man who has much immutable placements. We've seen some of those one-off transits from Saturn, but as we move closer towards mid-2029, Saturn in Taurus is bringing in more stabilising and realistic transits for Burnham. Now, as we move into July of 2029, Uranus will be in the area of roughly 16 to 17 degrees of Gemini. It will therefore mean that it squares with Burnham's natal Mars. Now, that can be quite a volatile transit, and it will take a good year to weave its particular magic. So we may feel overcome by urges to break free from anything that is holding us back, restricting us, preventing us from taking pure, clean actions. We want to break free, and we may do so in some rather unexpected and disruptive ways. It is not essentially a deal breaker, but is certainly one of those transits where we are best advised, again, step back, consider, think before you speak or act. And it is immensely interesting to think what might unfold at the next election, given our current polls. Neptune will be moving through the early degrees of Aries still during 2029. We are looking at a range of roughly 6 to 11 degrees of Aries, and will not be particularly bothersome, provided it doesn't affect his angles. And Pluto will be moving through Aquarius and will very likely still be in a long-term transit with his Uranus, which is bringing in that ability to instigate long-standing and powerful changes to current ways of working, and is a more gentle background kind of transit. So I can honestly say that I cannot see outer planets picking off heavy constellations of material or patterning in the natal chart that's going to be bothersome. However, we have so little information without houses or angles, and so what I've done is gone off to calculate Burnham's numerology over the next few years, and I'll show you that now. I find these numbers really interesting because the life path number is that of a 7. So we have someone who can be actually very introverted in their take on life. They are introspective. They pull inwards to analyse and mull things over, and there is also a certain spiritual kind of search going on. However, we tally this up with the destiny number of 4, which is extremely practical. And so there's that drive to fulfill a life purpose or destiny which requires us to put solid, tangible, structured, practical things into place during our life which work, and they work well, and moreover they will require hard work on our part. And all of this presents itself through the lens of a personality number, which is very dynamic. So our presentation to the world can be very confident. We're very independent by nature, and we direct ourselves forwards to achieve what we want. I think of all these numbers, it was actually the life path number of 7 which somewhat surprised me, because it is such an introspective and analytical kind of number. I do also place both the numbers in the birth date and also all the numbers that I can derive from the person's birth name, and this tells me a little bit more. Where you see arrows drawn indicates a lack of digits or a full line of digits, and they each represent differing characteristics. And so there is an arrow of hypersensitivity here using the birth date, and this is something in common actually with Nigel Farage. Moreover, there is an impractical streak to the personality, and so because of this and all the missing numbers, we would look more carefully at the numbers that are derived from the actual recorded birth name. And in this we can see that there are actually many potentials that are available for Burnham to develop during his life. And he can draw on characteristics of determination, good planning, an ability to keep his cool and maintain an emotional level, etc. What is very illuminating is that there are absolutely no 6s in either of those grids. And this lack of 6s is suggesting that the qualities that we need in order to be responsible to people around us, to nurture, to care for a growing family, for instance, they're not necessarily instinctive or effortless. It doesn't mean they can't be done, but those qualities may not come quite so easily to us, and so we have to work on it. Number 6 is all about caregiving, and in this respect, we don't feel naturally drawn to that role. So where we do undertake it, we do so in possibly a more practical way or in our own way, but it isn't a role that we would feel an instinctive urge to undertake. Now it's the bottom half of this slide which really impressed me with numerology, and this is where we step back and look at the wider life periods. There aren't many of them, and we do find things shift dramatically around the time that a life path period or a pinnacle is about to change. And moreover, the personal year numbers that accompany these different cycles are also illuminating. And what has been quite fascinating over Burnham's life is that he has entered the final few months of a life path period before it shifts. There are only 3 life path periods during a whole lifetime, so this shift is quite remarkable. For many years now, he has been in a life path period of 7, which actually reinforces the life path number that he was born with. However, this is about to change, and the new number comes in following his next birthday, which is in just about 4 months' time. He enters a life path period with a number 8. And this number 8 life path period runs now until the end of his life. 8 is a remarkable number in numerology because it brings attention to authority, to power. If you have a lot of 8 in your numerology chart, you have all the hard work and application that we would see with a number 4, but you have a bit more as well, because 8 also can bring great success at what you do. Now, if your goals are largely to do with status or finances, 8 is fantastic for that. This doesn't mean that people who have 8 prominently are going to be obsessed with money, although they can be. But some people can just simply be determined to go for what they want, and issues of being in charge and power become pivotally important during such a period. And so in this instance, I have to say the 8 is highly favourable. As he reaches this, the ultimate year in his life path period 7, we can also see that it is a personal year 9, and 9 involves completions, endings, shutting down of old phases. So that is quite apt, considering that he has indeed closed down his previous long-standing role as the Mayor of Manchester. The personal year 9 also speaks of harvesting the fruits of what we have planted, and indeed it is precisely that harvest which has led to him becoming so popular amongst many people. Now, next year, as his new life path period starts with that number 8, he also begins a personal year 1. And so I think next year is actually going to be the year when we could see distinct policy change, with or without problems, but nonetheless a year when he puts his own personal stamp on things, good and proper. This is a year of new beginnings, new seeds, and it lasts until his birthday in January of 2028. Now, to put this into perspective against Farage, for example, Farage is in a personal year number 8, and in that respect you can understand how issues of power, authority, control become so pivotal during 8 times. Farage isn't in a life path period of 8, but 8 is flavour of the year he is in at the moment. And indeed, of course, issues of control, of stepping down from authority, of stepping back into authority, of trying to keep a handle on the vastly changing circumstances around him. This is all highly pertinent for Farage this year. I just wanted to give you an idea of how 8 would manifest. 8 does not guarantee that if you are going for a position, you are going 100% to be successful and achieve it. What it does show us is that matters of power, authority, of driving towards success become much more dominant in your life. People do, incidentally, even undertake changes of their name on purpose in order to incorporate some of the 8 energy into their personal set of numbers. Such is the reputation of 8 for bringing in additional power and success. I'm not personally convinced, because I view it the same as a solar return. I believe we come in with some kind of contract or plan and things to achieve, and whether we move country or change our name is not going to alter much of that. But that's my personal view. Now, during any lifetime, we have 4 pinnacle cycles, and Burnham is in his final pinnacle. So this number 9 is going to remain for the rest of his life. 9 is about harvesting what we have sown. We are often shown ways of becoming much more humanitarian, compassionate. We can gradually broaden our perspective on how life works, and bit by bit we broaden our scope to include the concerns of humanity, not just our own personal drives. In this way we can use our experience to help people around us. Now, we are moving towards general election territory, possibly between January 2029 and Burnham's 60th birthday in 2030. So for him, this is a personal year number 3. Now, if the election is indeed held in a personal year 3, this would be a lovely number for social engagement, because the numbers 3 and also 5 are very outwardly directed towards engaging with other people. They're lighter, they're more expressive. We want to mix with the people around us, exchange ideas, be very creative, be very humorous. So not bad if this would tally with a campaigning period. Now, each year also has an essence to it, and what's noteworthy here is that we see the number 4 essence being repeated over the years for a few years, so that's quite important. And 4 is essentially the number of Burnham's destiny. So 4 is extremely practical. It's hard-working. It puts things into place which have been thought out in very logical, constructive ways and will be robust. It's a highly practical kind of energy. That does tally quite well with all of those placements in Capricorn. The exception is between 28 and January 29, when the essence is of 1, which is much more dynamic, independent, seeks to fulfill its own goals or objectives. And something about this year means a shift in tack for Burnham. Now, I am sorry that we don't have that birth time. I hope I've given you a bit more information on Burnham. By and large, I'm not seeing big shifts which would rock the boat. I often point out too that I personally lean towards the left of the political spectrum, but I have taken care to show you all relevant transits, good or bad, that would be arising between now and 2029. Would Burnham change my mind about the Labour Party? I really don't know about that. I will keep an open mind. I don't dislike him, but handsome is as handsome does, and that's what I'll be keeping my eye on. Thank you for watching. Now, 2029 is a long way away, and so please do not be disheartened if you are not supporting Burnham. Once we've set an election date, that is when I will be able to fine-tune my astrological forecasts. I need to look at the country's charts before I can come up with something concrete. Now, we are in eclipse season at the moment. We've just had a solar eclipse at 20 to 21 degrees of Leo, and we have a lunar eclipse at 5 degrees of Pisces, which is arriving shortly. This closely impacts at least one of the royal charts, but I'd also like to show you how to fine-tune your understanding of eclipses. They are seen as being wild cards, highly unpredictable, erratic, sometimes very difficult, sometimes exciting. How do we tell the difference? Because the royal charts are being triggered this year, I'll find a way to meld the two together and leave you with a much deeper understanding of how eclipses work. So until then, take the best care of yourselves, and God bless you all.